Last time on the Vintage Collector. Was the C64 CPM option a vaporware product? Obviously the US FTC thought so and ordered Commodore to deliver, but the product was impaired by many flaws, unable to read any known CPM disk formats, cutting itself short from the endless supply of CPM software. The subpar loading speeds and the 40 columns text mode made working with it the ultimate pain. This is September, the month to honor CPM, the ancestor to DOS. I'm the Vintage Collector and these are my stories. So after getting it to boot last time, let's do our first hands-on, which is also what the manual suggests, namely taking a backup of the master disk. Commodore provided the copy command for that purpose, which not only lets you format the disk but also perform a one-to-one disk copy. The latter spreads the typical contemporary feeling of the 80s. It prompts you for the disks, but doesn't give you any further indication about any potential progress of any sorts. 8 times in total I had to swap the disks, and it took somewhat 15 to 20 minutes. At least the copy seems to be functional, and I'll retain that as a master copy. For working purposes, I'll just create a third disk, which will complete in yet another 15 to 20 minutes time. According to this source, I need a basic program to patch CPM for using 2 disk drives. I'm not certain why that should be required, as at least Commodore put a config tool onto that copy of the system disk, and this lets you swap between single and dual disk configurations. So maybe that's only needed for an earlier revision of the C64 CPM. Apparently I don't have a second working floppy drive at hand, as these here both need a repair. But what I do have is an SD to IEC adapter, and I'll soon discover whether this works alongside CPM or not. And this is as important as I need to figure out a creative way how to transfer some CPM software onto the C64. Because one of the major flaws of Commodore's CPM solution lies in part in the disk drive technology. The Commodore 1541 floppy drive didn't implement the MFM encoding but used the group-coded recording technique. This made it impossible to read CPM formatted floppies of any kind. Although one should mention that there was a plethora of several hundred disk formats in the CPM world, there was maybe some 10 to 20 most common formats, and apparently neither could be read by the C64. And from what I've read, many software vendors were hesitant themselves in publishing their CPM software titles in the Commodore compatible disk format. This ultimately led to the situation that while there was hundreds if not thousands of CPM80 applications available, the entire C64 ecosystem was essentially locked out.
That couldn't have been a real problem though. CPM had the pip command, which allowed for file transfer via the serial interface.
Right, that would have been the solution. But that functionality was apparently stripped away from Commodore's pip version. And while I did find an old blog post of someone's mentioning another transfer program, the actual PDF file with the code was not archived by archive.org, hence lost, and I stood no chance in trying this one. I then found an article in the German 64er magazine explaining how CPM programs could be transferred from an Apple II onto the C64 by means of an obscure transfer cable. The article doesn't go into any details, probably because it was basically an instruction on software piracy, as it didn't mention what kind of cable that would be, yet even no hint on the software, yet another dead end. So I tried loading some software on an SD card and make it available via the SD to IEC adapter. As mentioned, I had configured CPM for 2 drives mode. So I loaded a D64 disk image from the SD to IEC and tried accessing it from CPM. But that apparently doesn't work, as I just got BDOS errors. Now, the SD2IC does not provide a full-fledged 1541 drive emulation, but just abstracts some high-level functions. That said, it's probably not compatible enough to work natively with CP/M. But apparently, while it doesn't throw any errors when reading a C64 formatted floppy, the output we get from CP/M is not very promising as well.
Why don't you try writing the programs directly onto the floppies then?
Because also the other way around, when running in C64 native mode, the kernel has no idea what to do with the CP/M formatted disk. It obviously still is a C64 formatted disk of some sorts, though contains a file named CP/M disk. This by itself contains a CP/M file system, which is not accessible from the C64. And thus, coming back to the earlier idea of transferring the programs via serial connection, this would not have worked out this way around, as neither the C64 itself could write onto the CP/M file system, nor could CP/M itself access the C64 file system. So I was starting to tinker around with Vice and ctools. My idea was to create disk images, inject the files I needed, and then transfer the image files onto real floppies. Installing Vice was actually simple, as by means of homebrew it's a simple command as brew install Vice. And of course I tried if I could run CP/M in Vice as well, but apparently attaching the CP/M cartridge always ended up in an obscure error. No discussion, I want to run it in the real gear afterwards, but I thought it would come in handy anyway, trying to run it in an emulation. So MAME it is then. I can simply install it using homebrew again with the brew install MAME command. As I had it installed already, I then simply created a new directory where I downloaded the ROMs into. Then I created a shell script with the required MAME commands, basically for pointing MAME to the correct ROMs, running it in windowed mode with the UI enabled, attaching the CP/M cartridge and the boot floppy. On startup, you see the latter enabled already. So running CP/M is exactly the same as on the real gear, and apparently it loaded up without any complaints. Coming back to my original objective, having Vice installed gives me the C1541 command. And by means of that utility, I can create a D64 floppy image and copy C64 programs onto it. In this example here, I'm transferring the C80 Diag basic files, which should provide me some test capability for the C80 cartridge. More on that in a moment. I'll also include a patcher to enable dual disk operations in CP/M, although as mentioned before, I believe that I won't need this one at all. But as we have seen, I need a different format for CP/M itself. This is where the ctools come into play. As these are not available via homebrew, I simply cloned the repository and compiled it myself. Using the then available ctools command, I can as well create an appropriate CP/M disk image and inject the files as needed, like here at the example of Zork. Of course, you need access to CP/M80 binaries, so you may be able to download any such software from, let's say, WinWorld PC and extract them yourself. On DOS, for example, the ctools utility may be helpful. Though WinWorld PC and many other sites sometimes even provide packaged zip files, which include the extracted binaries already. Your mileage may vary, but I found this to be the easiest actually to take and include them into my D64 disk images.
This all doesn't look very straightforward. How did Commodore think people would be dealing with their software back in the days?
I don't know. Apparently, they seemed to hope that publishers would deliver their software in the C64 native disk format, but that didn't seem to happen. And all the complexity, even with the modern days tools I have at my disposition right now, it's still like turning yourself in 3 circles. I mean, Commodore could even have brought along a new floppy drive supporting MFM recording that would have probably made life easier as well. Anyways, back to the real C64, I then tried transferring one of the created D64 image files onto a floppy disk. And as you can see, it didn't work at first, somewhat failing to format the disk. So I went back into the kernel, doing the format manually. And voila, the image transfer would work like a charm thereafter. This way, I created a whole bunch of floppy disks, each transfer typically taking around 5 minutes. Now, using SD Browser, it's also possible to increase the copy speed. This may look obscure and is not an error. The screen flickering is probably a result of SD Browser passing the data through the video RAM, so I assume in order to gain speed. This way, the transfers would only take roughly 1 minute per disk. However, as it turned out, I started seeing random disk access errors when working with any such created floppy disk, so I stuck with the slow but standard copy procedure. And finally, I could fire up Zork just for the fun. But oh my, we get to see 2 of the most discussed flaws right away. For one, it is terribly slow. From the moment I typed in the Zork command until it finally appears on screen, it takes a horrendous 2 minutes. And once it finally does, you'll see immediately the wraparound of the text. Not so much an actual issue, but still disturbing, as Zork as well assumes an 80 columns text display as opposed to the Commodore with its native 40 columns. I faced the same problem already last year when I interfaced the C64 through a serial adapter to a CP/M machine. Either you have an 80 columns hardware adapter or you go with a software emulation. For the 80 columns programs available, you can't just take any one for the C64 as you must run it specifically from within CP/M. Soft80.com is the tool to go. There's 2 versions out there, the original version from 1984 and a patched version. The latter fixes some issues with the screen output and the character echo routines. I added both to my CP/M boot floppy, renaming the patched Soft80 to nsoft80 so I could play around with both. Ultimately, I agreed to the statement found here that the patched version is better, also because it features the more familiar white on black display instead of the reversed black on white as seen in the original program. What I also found was that the 80 columns mode is better in monochrome mode. I had some color bleeding, which made things harder to read. Turning the CRT to all monochrome made it all better in this regard. Now, in case you're wondering, this is video output distortions not uncommon to these early C64 revision mainboards. This particular C64 underwent some repairs earlier this year, which also includes some fixing on the video output. So basically, improving it from this to this final state. But still, there's some leftovers which I couldn't fully get away with, leading now to this side effect on the soft 80 as seen here. Anyway, one might wonder why Commodore didn't include an 80 columns mode themselves. They surely must have known that many CP/M programs simply required this to work. And remember the Z80 Diag program I mentioned earlier. As I write about it here, I thought it to be a good idea to try it out, seeing if it tells me anything about the functional state of the CP/M cartridge. However, as you saw, it booted CP/M already, so we can assume it's running correctly anyway. Still, what would the Diagnostics program do? Now, my problem was that I couldn't get it to run at all at first. Neither did it work in Vice, which should have thrown an error anyway, as the CP/M cartridge emulation didn't work at all there. Nor did it work on the real C64 and neither in MAME. For whatever reason, that program found here didn't seem to do anything, and if anything at all, then it locked up the emulation and the C64 with the only means to recover using a power cycle. And I tried everything from pre-creating it from my host machine, but also typing it in or actually copy-pasting it from Vice and storing it to disk. Now the author here mentioned he altered the source code but didn't give a direct link to the original source code. At least he mentioned that it originally came from the C64 programmer's manual, so I went to check and noticed it definitely looking totally different. I then recreated the original source to run it, but apparently there's no visible screen output, so how to tell it's working? Especially when considering it giving you the exact same output for both the MAME and the Vice emulator, the former having the virtual CP/M cartridge, the latter not. And then I tried one more time to reconstruct roots code, aka copy-pasting it into Vice and saving it to disk. And apparently I had made the mistake somewhere, as this time over I would at least get some output on the C64. However, I would have expected it to also print some output when running in CE80 mode, but at least that's again not the case for either the two emulators. So what does it do on the real thing? So apparently it does nothing at all here as well, at least not the way I would expect it, namely telling me it's working one way or another. However, one must note it's not really a diagnostics program, but more a very simplified test program and as such not very thorough. And anyway, when CP/M already boots up, one might assume the cartridge is a known good already anyway. If you feel like digging it up into more detail, really looking like into what this inline bytecode is actually doing, then here's a list of the 8080 opcodes for deciphering the code. That's going too far for me at this stage, as it still remains the speed issue. While reading through some online sources, I eventually stumbled across this statement here by Thomas Tempelmann. It's not too long ago that some enthusiasts have brought back the historic 64 magazine, re-releasing as sort of a throwback. And Tempelmann had commented on the very first online reissue, where there was an article about the CP/M cartridge, claiming he wrote a fast loader for it. At the very first, I thought he just meant the fastload program that is readily available online, both as version 1.1 and 2.1. However, while trying to see if there's any visible effect on CP/M, which of course I didn't, I came to the conclusion that it must have been a different program he was talking about. Luckily, Thomas is still around and responds to his email address found on temple.org. And he responded to me confirming it was a separate program which had both 6502 and C80 code portions. But apparently it was lost and he didn't keep the stuff, so unless any one of you out there still has a copy floating around somewhere, the CP/M fast loader might be lost forever. Too sad, as I really would have loved to see the speed difference it would have made. In the end, Commodore didn't do themselves a favor with this product, as its flaws are obvious and it failed for exactly that reason. It doesn't go without saying they did a second attempt on CP/M for the Commodore 128. But as I don't have a C128 to try it out myself, that story is left open for maybe next year when there's another round of September episodes. What do you think about CP/M on the Commodore? Let me know in the comments below. And if you feel like supporting TPC, then please check out the various options for channel memberships or gear donation right here. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching and see you again next Sunday. Next on the Vintage Collector. This year's September series is almost done, but there's one more thing, which will also bring us back to the network series. Let's look into CPNet, the network-enabled version of CP/M.